The moment Julia Winslow opened her mouth at the Hargrove dinner table in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, every eye in the room went cold and flat as Winter Creek ice, and she knew before the night was over that Reverend Hargrove's son was never going to ask her to marry him. She had been talking about the cattle drives, about the way the Kishom Trail had shifted east on account of the new wire fencing spreading across the panhandle, about how she had read in the Caldwell commercial that the cattlemen were furious, and the homesteaders were equally furious, and nobody was going to win without somebody losing something they loved. She had not been showing off. She had genuinely wanted to know what the Reverend thought, because he was a man who moved between both communities and might have a sensible view on the matter. But the Reverend's wife, a small woman named Dorothea with a collar buttoned so tight it looked like punishment, had pressed her lips together until they disappeared entirely, and the Reverend's son, Harrison, who was 24 and broad-shouldered, and generally considered a fine catch in Sumner County, had looked at Julia the way a man looks at a cat that has just knocked his best hat off the peg. "Miss Winslow," Dorothea Hargrove said, very gently, setting her fork down with a small, precise click, "a woman of good character knows when a subject belongs to the men at the table." Julia was 22 years old. She had lived in Kansas for 5 years, having come west with her father after her mother died of fever in Missouri. She had helped her father run his dry goods store, had kept his ledgers, had learned to read weather by the color of morning sky and trouble by the set of a man's jaw. She was not a quiet woman. She had never been a quiet woman. Her father, Thomas Winslow, used to say that Julia had come into the world with opinions fully formed and had simply never seen a reason to keep them to herself. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Hargrove," Julia said, and she meant it as an apology even if the words did not exactly sound like one. "But the Reverend did ask what I thought." "I asked out of courtesy," the Reverend said, not unkindly but firmly enough that the table understood. Harrison Hargrove walked her to the gate afterward and told her, with the kind of practiced gentleness that men use when they have rehearsed a difficult thing, that he admired her intelligence enormously, but that a frontier wife needed to be a certain kind of woman, steady, quiet, undemanding of a man's attention in the way of conversation. "You talk too much for a frontier wife, Miss Winslow," he said. "I think you would be very unhappy in the kind of life I am building." Julia walked home in the dark, the dust of the unpaved street soft under her boots, the oil lamps of the saloon throwing yellow rectangles onto the road ahead of her, and she thought about what Harrison Hargrove had said. She turned it over the way you turn a stone to see what lives underneath. She considered whether he was right, whether she was simply too much, whether the fault was hers. By the time she reached the familiar wooden porch of her father's store, she had decided he was not right, but she also understood that in Caldwell, Kansas, in 1879, the opinion of Harrison Hargrove was the opinion of most of the marriageable men within 50 miles, and that was a real and practical problem if she ever intended to have a home of her own. Her father was still awake, sitting at the counter by the lamp, tallying figures in his ledger. Thomas Winslow was 51 years old, gray at the temples, with the patient eyes of a man who had learned that life would do what it wished regardless of his preferences. "How was dinner?" he asked. "I talked too much," Julia said. He looked up at her over his spectacles. "Says who?" "Says Harrison Hargrove, and I believe the entire Hargrove household concurred." Thomas set his pen down. "Well," he said, "Harrison Hargrove has the imagination of a fence post, and I have always thought so." He paused. "You are not going to marry him, I take it." "No," Julia said. "Good," said Thomas Winslow and went back to his figures. That was April. By June, Caldwell was a different town entirely. The cattle season had begun in earnest and the drovers were coming up from Texas by the thousands, pushing longhorns along the trail, and the town swelled with noise and money, and the complicated danger of men who had been riding hard for months and were looking for somewhere to put down the tension they had built up along the way. The Long Branch and the Red Dog were full every night. The boarding houses were packed. The jail was busy. It was on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June that Julia first properly noticed Elijah Finley. She had seen him before, in the way that you see people in a small town, a face at the edge of your awareness that you register without cataloging. He had come through Caldwell twice in the previous year with the Rafter C outfit out of San Antonio, a cattle operation of some size run by a man named Cortland, who had the reputation of running honest drives and paying fair wages. Elijah was the trail boss, which meant he was responsible for getting 800 to 1,000 head of longhorn cattle from the Texas brushland to the Kansas railhead, without losing too many men or too many cattle along the way, a task that required a particular combination of patience and authority and quick judgment that not many men possessed. He was 31 years old that June. He was not the tallest man in the room, but he was the kind of man your eyes found when you walked in, something composed and unhurried in his bearing that drew attention the way a still point draws attention in moving water. His hair was dark brown, his eyes were a gray-green that changed color depending on the light, and he had a scar along the left side of his jaw from a disagreement with a rancher's fence wire 4 years past that he considered mildly interesting rather than dramatic. Julia noticed him properly on that Tuesday morning because he was standing at her father's counter buying rope and axle grease and a tin of tobacco, and he was listening. That was what caught her. Not the strong line of his shoulders, or the way his hat was worn back slightly on his head, or even the quality of stillness he carried with him. What caught Julia Winslow was the fact that her father was telling Elijah Finley about the fence wire dispute that was spreading north from the Texas Panhandle, the same dispute she had tried to discuss at the Hargrove dinner table, and Elijah was not waiting politely for Thomas to finish so that he could say his own piece. He was actually listening. He was asking questions that showed he had absorbed what came before them. He was treating her father's words as if they had value. Julia had come downstairs to refill the jar of penny candy at the front of the store. She stood with the candy jar in her hands and listened to the two men talk, and felt something she could not quite name yet, something like recognition. Elijah bought his rope and his axle grease and his tobacco, thanked Thomas with a nod that managed to be both economical and genuine, and turned to leave. He paused when he saw Julia. "Miss Winslow," he said, because they had been introduced previously in the way of townspeople who knew each other by name without knowing each other by anything else. "Mr. Finley," she said. "Your father knows more about trail politics than most men I have met who actually live the trail," Elijah said. He was not flattering. He was simply stating a fact he had observed in the way of a man who said what he meant. Julia set the candy jar on the counter. "He reads everything he can get hold of," she said. "I help him with the reading when the print is too small for his eyes. We talk about most of it." Elijah looked at her for a moment with that gray-green gaze. "That sounds like a good way to live," he said. He went out. The bell above the door rang once and then was quiet. Julia stood at the counter and felt the morning arrange itself around that small exchange like a painting arranging itself around a central figure. She did not see him again for 3 days. The Rafter C outfit was camped south of town, holding the herd outside the city limits while Cortland negotiated prices with the cattle buyers who came down from the rail yards. It was standard business, the kind that kept Caldwell alive and kept it complicated. Julia watched the negotiations from the edges, the way she watched most things in town, with attention and quiet opinion. On the 4th day, a Friday, there was a dispute at the Eastern Water Trough. 2 outfits had brought their remuda in at the same time, and harsh words had escalated to something close to violence before the sheriff got there and separated the men. The Rafter C hands were not involved, but 2 of them had been nearby, and one had a bruised knuckle from pulling somebody else's man back from a confrontation. Julia was coming out of the hardware store when it happened. She saw the push and the raised voices and the moment when it might have gone very wrong, and she also saw Elijah Finley step between 2 men with his hands open and his voice steady. saying something she could not hear from her distance, but that clearly worked, because both men stepped back. She was still standing on the boardwalk when Elijah came past, heading back toward the livery where his horse was stabled. "That could have been considerably worse," she said. He stopped. He looked at her. "It could have," he agreed. "Men get wound up on a long drive. Takes a few days in town before they remember how to be people." "Do you get wound up?" she asked, and then immediately wondered if that was too direct a question for a woman to ask a man she barely knew. Elijah appeared to consider this genuinely. "I get tired," he said. "It is a different thing." "Tired of what?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who is deciding whether a question deserves the real answer or the comfortable one. "Of being responsible for everyone getting somewhere safe," he said. Julia nodded. She understood that particular kind of tired. She had felt it herself in the last years of her father's worsening eyesight, the way responsibility sat differently on the shoulders when it was constant and unshared. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" she asked. "We keep a pot on at the store." He said yes. That surprised her a little. She had half expected him to politely decline and move on. But he said yes, and he came back with her to the store, and her father was pleased to see him, and they sat around the small table at the back of the shop where the Winslows took their meals, and they drank coffee and talked for the better part of an hour. Julia talked. She talked about the fence wire and what it meant for the trail towns, and whether Caldwell could survive if the drives found another route or simply stopped coming north entirely. She talked about the homesteaders who were pushing into the open range, and whether they had a moral claim that outweighed the economic claim of the cattlemen. She talked about a piece she had read in the paper about range management practices being tried in parts of Colorado, and whether Kansas ranchers might consider something similar. She talked, and she noticed midway through that she was watching Elijah's face for the signs she had learned to read in other men, the slight glazing of the eyes that meant they had stopped listening, the polite tightening around the mouth that meant they were waiting for her to stop, the way Harrison Hargrove had once checked his pocket watch while she was in the middle of a sentence. Elijah's eyes did not glaze. His attention did not waver. He asked questions. Good questions. The kind that meant he had been tracking every word. When she paused to refill the coffee cups, he said something that she would turn over in her mind for the rest of that summer and long into the winter that followed. "You have thought about this considerably more carefully than most people who have a direct stake in it," he said. "I do not have a direct stake in it," Julia said. "I run a dry goods store." "You live here," Elijah said. "That is the stake." She sat back down across from him, and they went on talking, and her father listened and occasionally contributed. And outside the window of the store, the town of Caldwell went about its Friday business. And Julia thought that this was exactly the kind of afternoon she had always wanted, without ever quite knowing how to name what she was wanting. He left just before supper. He shook Thomas's hand and touched his hat brim to Julia, and said he hoped to see them again before the Rafter Sea moved on. "You are welcome to supper tomorrow if the negotiating keeps you in town," Thomas said, with the easy generosity of a man who genuinely meant it. Elijah said he would try. He came for supper on Saturday. He came for supper on Sunday. By the following Friday, when the Rafter Sea had sold its cattle and was preparing to start the long ride back to Texas, Julia had spoken more honestly and easily with Elijah Finley than she had spoken with any man outside her own father, and she understood that this was a significant thing, and that it was about to end, and that the ending of it was going to leave a space in her daily life that she could already feel the shape of. On the morning the Rafter Sea rode out, Elijah came to the store alone, on horseback, the rest of his crew already moving south toward the Caldwell city limits. He stepped down off his horse and came inside, hat in hand, which was a thing he did not do as a habit, and her father found a reason to go check something in the back, which was a thing Thomas Winslow had never done once in Julia's memory without being asked. Elijah stood across the counter from Julia, and the morning light came through the dusty front windows, and the store smelled of coffee and dried goods and the particular clean smell of new rope. "I want to tell you something before I leave," he said. "All right," Julia said. "I have been listening to you all week," he said. "Not because I was being polite, because I genuinely wanted to hear what you were going to say next. That does not happen to me very often. I wanted you to know that." Julia looked at him. She felt something press warm against the inside of her chest, something that had weight and substance and was not the same as being flattered. "I want to tell you something in return," she said. "Go ahead." "I was told recently that I talk too much for a frontier wife," she said, "by a man who was considering whether to court me." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "Did he give you a reason?" "He said a frontier wife ought to be steady and quiet and undemanding of a man's attention in the way of conversation." Elijah set his hat on the counter. He picked it up again. He appeared to be choosing words with the same care he used for everything else. "That is an extraordinary amount of foolishness from a man who had the opportunity to know you," he said. "I hope you are not planning to believe it." "I am trying not to," Julia said. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the morning rearranged itself again around the center point of his gaze. "I will be back through Caldwell in August," he said. "The Rafter Sea has another drive scheduled for late summer. If your father is agreeable, I would like very much to call on you properly when I come back." Julia's heart did something she would have been embarrassed to describe out loud. "I think my father would find that agreeable," she said. "I think so too," Elijah said, and his mouth curved in the kind of smile that a serious man uses when something has moved him, and he is not quite ready to put it into ordinary words. He picked up his hat. He went out. The bell above the door rang once. Julia stood at the counter and listened to the sound of his horse moving away down the street, and she did not try to stop the smile that spread slowly across her face like the first warm day after a long winter. The weeks between June and August were not idle ones. Thomas Winslow's eyesight had been worsening for over a year, and by midsummer of 1879, the effort of reading the small print in the ledgers was giving him headaches that left him sitting in the dark back room with a wet cloth over his eyes for an hour at a time. Julia took on the full management of the store's accounts, which she had already been doing in practice for most of the past year, but now it was official and constant, and there were days when she did not get outside before the sun went down. The store was doing well enough. Caldwell was a cattle town, and cattle town commerce ran on a particular rhythm: feast during the drive season and careful management during the winter months, and Julia had become expert at reading that rhythm and stocking accordingly. She ordered extra boots and harness leather and rope in the spring. She stocked heavier goods in the fall, the kinds of things that homesteaders and ranchers needed for the winter months: flour and salt and lard, and the heavy wool blankets that were manufactured in a town 50 miles east, and that she had arranged a fair deal to receive on consignment. She also wrote. She had always kept a journal, a habit her mother had given her along with a love of books, and a belief that women's thoughts were worth recording even if no one ever read them. But in that summer of 1879, with Elijah's words sitting warm in her chest, she wrote differently. She wrote about the town, and the people in it with a sharpness and a tenderness she had not known she had, as if his attention had given her permission to take her own observations seriously. She also found herself, 3 times in that July, walking past the Hargrove house with a feeling she could not quite dignify as smugness, but that was in the vicinity. The town of Caldwell in those years was a place of genuine complexity, a border between one world and another, between the open range and the fenced homestead, between Indian territory to the south and American settlement to the north, between old ways of living and new ones pushing in from every direction. Julia was aware of these complexities in the way that intelligent people who pay attention become aware of the water they are swimming in. She saw the injustice in the way that the Osage and the Cherokee were being pressed ever further into Indian territory, their land shrinking season by season. She saw the injustice in the way that women were expected to work as hard as men while being granted a fraction of the legal and social standing. She held these awarenesses as facts about the world she lived in, not as paralyzing griefs, but as things that a person of conscience kept in mind. August came. The heat in Kansas in August was a physical presence, a weight you moved through rather than weather you experienced. The air smelled of cattle and dust, and the particular dry sweetness of curring grass, and the days were long and golden, and the nights were thick with stars and insect sound. The Rafter Sea arrived in Caldwell on the 14th of August, 1879, coming up from the south in a cloud of red dust and bawling cattle, and Elijah Finley rode at the head of the outfit with his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, looking exactly as Julia had held him in her mind for 2 months, which was a thing she found quietly satisfying. He came to the store that first evening, trail dirty and tired in the bone-deep way of a man who had been in the saddle for weeks, and Thomas met him at the door and told him to come back tomorrow when he had slept and eaten a proper meal. Elijah laughed. It was the first time Julia had heard him laugh properly, not just a polite acknowledgement of something amusing but an actual laugh, surprised out of him by Thomas's bluntness, and it transformed his face in a way that made Julia's breath stop for a second. He came back the next morning, clean and rested, and they sat on the porch of the store in the morning before the heat built up, and they talked for 3 hours. They talked about everything they had each thought about over the summer, the trail and the store and the books they had read and the things happening in the wider world, the new president, the railroads continuing spread westward, the drought conditions in parts of Texas. They talked about small things too, a funny thing that had happened on the drive involving a particularly opinionated mule, a conversation Thomas had conducted with a traveling salesman that had resulted in the store acquiring a quantity of patent medicine that nobody in Caldwell apparently needed. They laughed together easily, and Julia noted this as a fact about the both of them, that they had the same sense of the ridiculous. He called on her every day for the 2 weeks the Rafter Sea was in Caldwell finishing its business. He was formal about it in the way that men of his generation and background were formal. That is to say, he treated the calling as a serious thing and not a casual one. But there was nothing stiff or obligatory about the actual time they spent. He brought her a book he had found in a store in Wichita, a collection of essays about natural history that he had thought she would find interesting. She read him the passages that had pleased her most, out loud, sitting on the porch in the evenings, while Thomas sat inside with his pipe, and the comfortable knowledge that his daughter was in good hands. On the evening of the 3rd day, Elijah said to her with his characteristic directness, "I want to ask you something." "All right," Julia said. "What do you want?" he asked. "Not what you are willing to settle for, what you actually want your life to look like." Nobody had ever asked her that before. Not like that, not as a serious question requiring a serious answer. She thought about it for a moment. She looked out at the street, at the lamplit dust of an August evening in Caldwell, Kansas, at the movement of horses and people, and the distant sound of the Long Branches piano reaching out into the warm dark. "I want a home that I have a real part in," she said. "Not just a woman's part. I want to know what is happening on the land and have something real to say about it. I want to talk to the person I am living with. I want them to actually want to hear what I think." She paused. "I want the kind of talking that you and I do. I want that as an ordinary daily thing." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "That does not sound like too much to ask," he said. "Harrison Hargrove thought it was," she said. "Harrison Hargrove is a fool," Elijah said simply, as if this were a thing he had considered and concluded during the 2 months he had been back in Texas. Julia looked at him sideways in the evening light. "Do you know him?" "I met him last season when I was through Caldwell," Elijah said. "I thought then that he had a very high opinion of silence for a man who has never had anything particularly interesting to say." Julia covered her mouth with her hand because she was laughing and she was trying not to laugh that hard. "You should not say such things," she told him, still laughing. "It is the truth," Elijah said, and his mouth was doing the thing it did when he was pleased but trying to be dignified about it. They sat on the porch until the night was fully dark and the stars were thick overhead, and Julia felt something she had not felt in years, maybe had never felt, the sensation of being entirely comfortable in her own skin next to another person, of not having to measure what she said before she said it, of being able to simply be the full size of herself without the sense that she was filling a space she was not entitled to. It was on the second Thursday of his visit that he asked her. They had been walking in the early evening, past the church and down the main street and out toward the edge of town where the road went south into the open country, and the sky was a color that Julia could not name, something between gold and rose and gray that lasted only a few minutes before the full dark came. Elijah stopped walking. He turned to face her. He was not a man who approached important things sideways. She had learned. He went straight at them, and now he looked at her with that gray-green gaze that she had memorized over the course of 2 months of wondering about it. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "But I want to tell you some things first, and I want you to hear them before you answer." "All right," Julia said. "The life I have is not a settled one yet," he said. "I trail boss for Cortland, which means I am on the road half the year, and I cannot promise that will change quickly. I have been saving money toward land of my own in Texas, on the Frio River, a piece of country that I know and that I believe could be made into something good. That is maybe 2 years away if everything goes as it has been going." He looked at her steadily. "I cannot offer you a house right now. I can offer you my word that I am working toward one." Julia listened. "I can tell you what I can offer," he went on. "I can tell you that I would spend every evening talking with you if that was how we wanted to spend our evenings. I can tell you that I have never in my life been less than honest, and that I do not intend to start now. I can tell you that what you have to say matters to me, and that I would never want you to be less than you are." He paused. "And I can tell you that I have been thinking about you since the last time I rode out of this town, and that I believe very strongly that I am in love with you." The last part he said with the slight difficulty of a man who does not use those words easily, which made them more true rather than less, and Julia felt the full weight of them settle over her like something warm and solid. "I need to ask you one thing," she said. "Ask it. Is what we have been doing these 2 weeks, the talking, the way you listen, is that because you are courting me, or is that because that is who you are?" He understood the question exactly. She could see it in the way his expression shifted. "It is who I am," he said. "I have always been this way. I am not performing for you." Julia looked at the sky, at the last of that unnamed color fading into deep blue. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had done that. His hand was calloused and warm and held hers with a steadiness that matched everything else about him, and they stood there on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, in the last of the summer light, and Julia thought that she had been right to not believe Harrison Hargrove. Thomas Winslow cried when they told him. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in the quiet way of a man who has been carrying a worry for a long time and has just been relieved of it. He had worried about Julia, he admitted later to her alone, not because she was incapable but because the world was often unkind to capable women, and he had been afraid that her particular quality of intelligence and honesty would make it harder for her to find the person who deserved her rather than easier. "I knew from the first time I saw him listen to her," Thomas told Julia, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief, "that he was a different kind of man." They were married in October of 1879, in Caldwell's small Presbyterian church, on a day when the sky was the clear cold blue of full autumn, and the leaves of the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold. Julia wore a dress she and Thomas had ordered from a seamstress in Wichita, a deep blue wool that was practical enough for the frontier and beautiful enough for a wedding. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had pressed in July and kept for this purpose, which struck several of the women present as unconventional and struck Julia as exactly right. Elijah stood at the front of that small church and watched her walk toward him with an expression that Julia would remember for the rest of her life. a kind of quiet undoneness, as if everything he had carefully held in order had been gently rearranged by the sight of her in that blue dress in the autumn light. They said their vows. She meant every word. She could see that he did too. The reception was in the back of Thomas's store because it was the largest private space available, and also because it was their place, the place where they had first really talked, and that seemed right to both of them. The Rafter C hands who were still in town came and were well-behaved and festive in equal measure. A few of Caldwell's leading citizens attended, including, notably, the Reverend and his wife, who had the grace to seem genuinely pleased, though Harrison Hargrove was conspicuously absent, which Julia found she did not mind at all. A woman named Marta Schultz, who ran the boarding house and had become something like a friend to Julia over the previous years, caught Julia by the arm at one point in the evening and said, quietly, "He looks at you like you are the most interesting thing in the room." "He actually listens," Julia said. Marta squeezed her arm. "That is everything," she said. The first months of their marriage were a particular kind of happiness that Julia had not known how to anticipate. She had understood that she was in love with him, had understood that they suited each other in mind and temperament, but she had not quite prepared herself for the physical reality of being married to him, the morning and evening constant presence of someone who was entirely on her side. He had been honest about his circumstances, completely honest, which meant they had no house of their own yet, and were living in the rooms above Thomas's store for the winter season. It was not a grand domestic arrangement, but it was warm and it was theirs. 2 rooms that Julia arranged with the practical creativity of a woman who had grown up making things work with what was available. A braided rug she made herself, curtains from a bolt of calico she had in store, a writing table for her journal and his ledger that they sat at together in the evenings. They talked. God, they talked. Julia had not been exaggerating when she had told Elijah that talking with him was what she wanted as an ordinary daily thing. They talked over breakfast in the early dark of winter mornings when the frost came in under the door and the stove crackled. They talked late into the evenings when the wind came off the plains and pressed against the windows. They talked about the store and about the trail, and about what they were reading and what they thought and what they believed. They argued sometimes, with the clean energy of 2 people who respected each other enough not to pretend to agree when they did not, and the arguments were not frightening but clarifying, and they came out the other side of them knowing more about each other and themselves. Elijah was not a man who softened his opinions for her comfort, which was something she specifically appreciated. He told her when he thought she was wrong, and he explained why, and he listened to her response, and sometimes he changed his mind and sometimes he did not, and both outcomes felt respectful. She learned him in the winter months, the particularity of who he was. He was not demonstrative in public, not the kind of man who made grand gestures in front of others, but in the privacy of their rooms he was different. He had a habit of sitting close to her when they were reading, close enough that their shoulders touched, as if simple physical contact were something he needed and had perhaps been doing without for a long time. He brought her coffee before she asked for it in the mornings. He had a tendency to pause in the middle of work or reading to read something aloud to her that had struck him, a sentence from a newspaper, a line from whatever book was in front of him, as if he thought of her immediately whenever he encountered something interesting. One evening in January, a hard, cold January when Caldwell was locked in and the cattle business was entirely stopped, and the nights lasted forever, they were sitting together at the writing table, Julia working on the store accounts and Elijah writing a letter to Cortland about the next drive season, and the lamp threw a warm circle around them, and outside the windows the wind was enormous and indifferent. Elijah put down his pen and looked at her. "What?" Julia said without looking up from the ledger. "I was just thinking," he said. "What were you thinking?" "That Harrison Hargrove is a fool," he said. Julia looked up. Elijah's expression was entirely serious. "You are still thinking about what he said," Julia said. "Occasionally," Elijah said. "When I think about how different this would be if you had believed him, He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know something. I want you to know that the thing about you that Harrison Hargrove thought was a fault is the same thing that I consider the best part of my life." Julia set down her pen. "The talking," she said. "The talking," he said. "The thinking. The way you say what is true instead of what is comfortable. The way you are interested in everything." He paused. "I have been listening to you since the first week I knew you. I have been listening because you are worth listening to. That is not going to change." Julia looked at her husband in the lamplight on that January night and felt something so large and clear move through her that it had no name in the vocabulary she had been raised with, only the vocabulary she had been building for herself. "I think you may be the best thing that has ever happened to me," she said. "I feel the same," he said simply, and picked up his pen again, and they went back to their respective work, together in the warm circle of the lamp while the winter raged outside. And Julia thought that this exact moment, ordinary as it was exactly what she had always been wanting. Spring came back to Caldwell with mud, and then with wildflowers, and then with the long, clear light of May, and with it came the cattle season and Elijah's departure. He had to go. He had been honest with her from the start about this. The Rafter Sea needed him for the drive, and the money from the drive was what was building toward their land on the Frio River, and Julia understood all of this and had agreed to it before they married. But understanding a thing does not prevent you from feeling it when it arrives. He left on the first morning of May, in the gray light before sunrise, with his bedroll tied to his saddle and the Rafter Sea hands waiting in the road below. Julia came down with him, wrapped in her coat, her hair braided over one shoulder. They stood beside his horse in the cold half-dark and said goodbye in the way of two people who have learned to be honest with each other about difficult things. "I will write," he said. "I will write back," she said. "Take care of yourself and your father," he said. "We will be fine," she said. He put his hands on her face, both of them, something he only did in private and only when something important was happening, and he looked at her with the full weight of that gray-green gaze. "I am coming back to you," he said. "I know you are," she said. He kissed her. He mounted his horse. He rode south with his crew into the growing light, and Julia stood in the road until the dust of them had disappeared, and then went back inside to make coffee and start the day. She threw herself into the work of that summer. The store kept her busy, more than busy. Thomas's health had declined in the winter months, and he was tired in a way that sleep did not seem to fix, and Julia had taken on everything. She wrote to Elijah twice a week, long letters that she filled with everything she was thinking and seeing and reading, letters that she knew would likely arrive in batches rather than one at a time, that he would read all at once somewhere along the trail, but that she wrote as if he were just on the other side of a wall and she was calling to him through it. His letters came back. Not as often as hers. He was on a cattle drive with 800 head and limited time at any writing desk, but they came, and they were Elijah in every line, economical and honest and warm in the specific way that he was warm, which was not surface warmth but the deeper kind that takes time to reveal. One of his letters, arriving in late June, contained a paragraph that she read 3 times and then carried in her pocket for a week. He wrote, "I was thinking yesterday about what you said last winter about the difference between land you own and land you belong to. I think you were right that the second thing is more true. I have been watching the country we are passing through and trying to determine which it is for me, and I believe the answer is the second. I belong to this country. I hope it will let me belong to you in the same way, which is to say not ownership but a kind of rootedness that does not require walls." She read that paragraph to her father, who nodded slowly and said, "He is a good man, Julia." "I know he is," she said. Thomas Winslow's health had become a real concern by that summer. He was losing weight, and the headaches that had started as occasional things were now frequent and severe. And a doctor who came through Caldwell in July looked at him carefully and told Julia privately that Thomas's heart was not in good condition and that he needed rest and reduced activity. Thomas, when told this, said, "Well, That is very inconvenient," and went back to trying to do more than he should, and Julia spent a significant portion of her energy that summer preventing him from lifting things and keeping him out of the store on the hottest days. She did not write this to Elijah immediately. She wrote it in August, when she was certain enough about what she was seeing to say it plainly, and she was honest about it because she had promised herself and him that she would be. She wrote that her father was unwell, that the doctor's concern was serious, that she was managing, and that she did not want him to leave the drive early on account of it because the money mattered and Thomas would hate being fussed over. She also wrote that she wanted him to know because she did not want there to be things she had not told him. His response, when it came, was exactly what she would have expected. He wrote that he was coming back in September as planned, that he was grateful she had told him, that if she needed him sooner she had only to send word. He wrote, "You do not have to manage alone. I will be there." He was back in Caldwell in the middle of September, earlier than the previous year because the drive had gone well, and the sale was completed quickly, and he walked into the store on a Tuesday afternoon, and Julia came around the counter, and he held her for a long time without saying anything, which was its own kind of talking. Thomas was thinner and slower, but he was still himself, opinionated and interested in everything and glad to see Elijah, and the three of them sat together that evening at the back table and talked until Thomas fell asleep in his chair, which he did sometimes now, and Elijah carried him gently to his bed and covered him with his blanket, and Julia watched this and felt the love she had for her husband sit warm and full in her chest like a second heart. Later, in their own room, Elijah told her that he had put in an offer on the land by the Frio River. Julia went very still. "You have," she said. "Cortland knows the owner," Elijah said. "The man is willing to sell and the price is reasonable. I have enough saved for the down payment if the Rafter C drives go as planned through next year. The deed would be ours possibly by the following spring. Land, a house, a place that was theirs. Tell me about it," Julia said. He told her. He told her about the Frio River country in south-central Texas, the cedar and live oak, and the way the river ran clear and cold even in summer, the rolling hills and the particular quality of the light in that country, which was different from Kansas, drier and brighter, and harder-edged in a way that he found beautiful. He told her about the size of the property and what it could support, and how he was thinking about running a small herd rather than managing drives for someone else, which would mean he was home rather than gone 6 months of the year. "You would be home," Julia said. "I would be home," he said. She got up and crossed the room and sat beside him on the edge of the bed, close enough that their shoulders were touching, which was his way of being near someone, and she had adopted it from him. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." She took a breath. "I think I am with child," she said. The silence that followed was one of those silences that has texture and weight, that is not empty but full of all the things that a moment contains when it is a truly significant one. Elijah turned to look at her. The lamplight was on his face, the scar along his jaw and the gray-green eyes that were fully dark in this light, and his expression was the undoneness she had seen on their wedding day, the careful order of him gently rearranged. "You think," he said. "I am quite certain," she said. "But I said think because I am not a doctor." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. They sat there for a long moment together in the lamplight, in the rooms above her father's store in Caldwell, Kansas, on a September evening in 1880, and the world was larger than it had been that morning and also more particular, more precise in its beauty. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, "in the best way." Thomas took the news with a broad, quiet happiness that Julia would treasure for the rest of her life. He sat back in his chair and looked at the two of them and said, "Your mother would have loved to know this." And Julia felt the tears come before she could stop them, because her mother had been dead for 7 years, and the ache of that absence was no smaller for time, only different in texture. She wrote about this in her journal that night. about the way joy and grief are not opposites but companions, about how the largest moments of your life arrive carrying all the previous ones inside them, and she felt her mother present in the room with her, in the particular way that the people we have loved and lost become part of the fabric of who we are. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was a settling-in time. Elijah stayed in Caldwell through the cold months, working on the plans for the Texas property, corresponding with Cortland about one final drive season in the spring that would complete his financial commitment, and spending the evenings at the table with Julia and Thomas and the growing reality of the child, whose movements Julia reported with an exactness and wonder that Elijah received with equal wonder. He had a habit she adored. Whenever she described something the baby had done, a kick, a turning, a particular hour in the afternoon when the movements were most active, he would stop whatever he was doing and give her his full attention, the way he gave everything his full attention, and the way he listened made her feel that the ordinary miracle of what she was experiencing was being properly witnessed. He built things that winter. He was a capable man with wood and tools, having grown up on a working ranch in Texas where you made what you needed or you did without. And he built a cradle that was beautiful in the simple way that things made with care and skill are beautiful, sturdy and smooth, with curved rockers that he cut from a single piece of good cedar he had traded for at the lumber yard. Julia watched him work on it in the evenings and thought that there was something specific about watching a person do a thing they were good at, the quality of concentration and competence together. That was one of the more intimate things she knew. "You are watching me," he said one evening without looking up from the sanding. "I am," she said. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking that you are a good man," she said. He looked up. "What else?" "That I am very glad Harrison Hargrove thought I talked too much," she said. He smiled at that, the real smile, the one that changed his whole face. "So am I," he said, and went back to his work. The baby came in March of 1881, a cold and clear-skied March day when the ground was still frozen but the light had shifted toward spring. He was born in the room above the store, attended by the town's midwife, a practical and cheerful German woman named Frau Bergman who had delivered a significant portion of Sumner County, and Elijah was present for all of it, which was not the common practice of the time, but was something both Julia and Elijah had decided made sense, because they had decided that their life was going to be the kind in which they faced things together. It was not easy. It was the hardest physical thing Julia had ever done, and there were hours in the middle of it when she was purely engaged with the work of it, and there was no room for anything else. Elijah stayed. He held her hand and did not say comforting things that were not true, which was exactly right. And when it was done and Frau Bergman put the baby in Julia's arms, Elijah sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at his son with an expression that was entirely new on his face, something young and undefended that Julia filed away in the part of her memory reserved for precious things. They named him Thomas after her father, who cried again and was not quiet about it this time. Thomas Sr. held the baby that first afternoon, sitting carefully in his chair, the old man and the new person regarding each other with the serious attention that newborns give everything, and Julia thought that the room in that moment held more love per square foot than she had previously believed was possible. The spring was full and beautiful and exhausting in the specific way of new parenthood. Julia was tired in her bones, but she was also alert and alive in a new way. The world rearranged around this small person who had come into it. She wrote in her journal almost every day, recording details she did not want to lose, the exact weight of Thomas in her arms, the sound of his breathing, the way his hand gripped her finger with a strength that seemed outsized for his size. Elijah was a father in the way she had expected he would be, which was to say attentive and honest and present. He did not perform fatherhood for other people's benefit. He simply was there, patient with the small person's demands in the same way he was patient with everything, steady through the difficult nights without complaint, genuinely interested in every development and change. He left for the spring drive in late April, later than he should have, because Thomas had developed a cough that worried them both and he had not wanted to go until the child was clearly on the mend. When he finally went, he rode out with the particular compressed feeling of a man who is tearing himself from something, which Julia saw and understood. She managed. She always managed. The store kept her occupied, and Thomas, the baby Thomas, was a generally agreeable child who seemed to find the activity of the store interesting, and she kept him in the sling she had made and went about her work with him close to her chest, which he appeared to prefer. Thomas Sr. was weaker that spring. He spent more time in his chair and less time on his feet, and Julia began preparing herself for something she did not want to prepare for. He died in June, on a Tuesday afternoon, in his chair by the window where the afternoon light came in. He had been reading the newspaper when Julia came in with his supper, and he had fallen asleep, and when she touched his shoulder he did not wake, and she stood in the quiet room and understood that her father was gone, and held that understanding for a long moment before she sat down on the floor beside his chair and cried in the deep way that only the grief of losing a parent allows. She wrote to Elijah that night. She lit the lamp and sat at the writing table with the baby asleep in the cradle beside her, and she wrote him the full truth of what she was feeling, the grief and the gratitude, and the strange lightness that sometimes comes when someone who has been suffering for a long time finally rests. She wrote about her father's goodness and his patience, and the way he had always treated her thoughts as worth having. She wrote about the last thing he had said to her that morning, which had been to remark that the baby's eyes were going to be like hers. He could see it. She sealed the letter and put it in the mail bag and sat in the quiet store alone for a while, and felt the absence of her father like a physical change in the air pressure of the place, and then she got up and made sure the baby was covered and went to bed, because tomorrow was a day that would need her and grief did not excuse her from her responsibilities. This was not hardness. It was simply the frontier, which did not pause for private sorrow. Elijah arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks after Thomas's death, ahead of the rest of the Rafter C outfit, having arranged things with Cortland to allow him to ride on ahead. He arrived in the early morning before the town was fully awake, and Julia heard his horse in the road and came downstairs and opened the door, and he was there, dusty from the road, with the look of a man who has been riding hard. He said nothing. He came in and held her, and she let herself lean into him entirely, which she had not done for anyone in the weeks since her father died, having been holding herself carefully upright for the sake of the store and the baby and the town's perception of her competence. She cried properly then, for the first time, and he held her and did not tell her it would be all right, and did not offer platitudes, and did not rush her. He simply held her and let her grieve and was there, which was the only thing that could have helped and which he somehow knew. After a long while she straightened and stepped back and looked at him and said, "You rode fast." "I did," he said. "You did not need to." "I know I did not need to," he said. "I wanted to." She made coffee. He held the baby, who regarded this tall stranger with Thomas's gray-eyed seriousness, and then decided he approved. Elijah sat at the table where they had first really talked in the first summer, and held his son and let the baby grip his finger with that extraordinary strength, and looked at Julia with an expression that she could read clearly by now, which was that he was thinking about how much this place and these people meant to him. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I spoke with Cortland before I left the drive," he said. "This is my last season with the Rafter C. The land deal on the Frio is finalized. The papers are drawn. We own it." Julia sat down. "We own it," she said. "It is ours," he said. "I am done driving cattle for other men. We are going to Texas." The weeks that followed were the complicated process of closing one life down and packing it for a new one. The store had to be disposed of, and Julia and Elijah together decided that selling it was the right thing, that there was no purpose in holding onto it when they would be gone to Texas. They sold it to a man named Pierce who was new to Caldwell and looking for a trade, selling it at a fair price that left them with a modest cushion beyond the land money, which was the kind of practical good fortune Julia had learned to receive with quiet gratitude rather than expectation. She packed her father's things carefully, keeping the things that had been most his books and his ledger books and the photograph of her mother that had lived on the shelf above the counter for all 5 years they had been in Caldwell. She packed her own things, her journals and her books and the blue dress she had married in, which still fit her, and the braided rug from the room upstairs, which she had made herself and intended to put in the new house. She said goodbye to Caldwell with mixed feeling. It was not home in the way her heart used to ache for home. It was a place she had lived and worked and grown up in, and she was glad of what it had given her, which was primarily Elijah and the understanding of what kind of life she wanted. She said goodbye to Marta Schultz, who cried and made her promise to write, which she did. She said goodbye to Frau Bergman, who told her that if she had another baby she should find a good midwife, because not all midwives were equally skilled, which was practical and entirely in character. She did not say goodbye to Harrison Hargrove, who was by that point married to a woman Julia had met twice, a pleasant and quiet young woman who appeared to be steady and undemanding in the way Harrison had required, and Julia genuinely wished them both well, without irony. They left Caldwell on a September morning of 1881, heading south. Elijah drove the wagon with the baby in Julia's arms beside him and their household packed behind, and the Rafter C hands who had finished the drive were riding out of town in the same general direction, and gave them a good-natured send-off, whooping and waving their hats. Julia looked back once at the main street of Caldwell, at the dry goods store that was already becoming Pierce's dry goods store, at the church where she had married, at the boardwalk where she had watched cattle drives come and go for 5 years. Then she faced south, toward the long road and whatever was at the end of it, and the baby made a sound of contentment in her arms, and Elijah's shoulder was solid and warm against hers. "Tell me about the house," she said. He told her about the house. It was not much yet, he said. It was a basic structure, 4 rooms, built in the solid, practical way of a man who was thinking about what came before decoration. But it sat on a rise above the Frio River with the live oaks around it and the hills going away to the south and the light coming in the west-facing windows in the evenings like something poured rather than shining. "There is a porch," he said. "A porch," she said. "A big one," he said. "I built it wide on purpose." "Why wide?" He gave her a sideways look that contained something warm and private. "Because I knew you were going to want to sit on it and talk," he said. Julia laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder, and the wagon moved south into the long country, and young Thomas made another sound of contentment, and the September sky was enormous and blue overhead, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be and exactly who she was supposed to be, and she knew it clearly. The trip to the Frio River country took the better part of 2 weeks, moving steadily south through Kansas and into Indian Territory, and then down into the rolling hills of central Texas. The country changed as they went, the flat Kansas grassland giving way to hill country that grew more dramatic as they moved south, the vegetation shifting from the open plains grasses to scrubby cedar and live oak, the sky somehow wider and harder and more brilliant. Julia observed everything. She asked questions of the people they met along the way, at the water crossings and the small settlements and the trading posts, because she was a person who found other people interesting and believed that the easiest way to understand a place was to talk to the people who lived in it. Elijah drove and listened and occasionally contributed, and the baby slept and woke and observed the world from his mother's arms with his father's considering eyes. There were moments on that journey that were uncomfortable, the long days and the cold nights when camping was harder than the road. There were moments that were genuinely difficult, a river crossing that took most of a day and tested everyone's patience, a night when the baby was feverish and neither of them slept, and the darkness outside the wagon seemed vast and indifferent. But there were also moments of such particular beauty that Julia recorded them carefully in her journal. The moonrise over the hills on the fourth night, a day when they traveled along a creek lined with pecans, and the light came through the canopy in pieces. A morning when she watched Elijah saddle his horse in the early light with the cedar hills behind him, and thought that this was what it looked like when a person was precisely in the right place. They arrived at the Frio River property on the last day of September in the golden late afternoon, and Julia's first sight of it was from the top of the rise where the road came over and the house appeared below them, small and solid and surrounded by the live oaks and the golden grass, and the river just visible through the trees as a brightness and a sound. She said nothing for a moment. She simply looked. "Well," Elijah said. "It is beautiful," she said, and she meant it in the straightforward way she meant everything without performance. He looked sideways at her. "I hoped you would think so." "You built the porch wide," she said. "I did," he said. "Good," she said, and he lifted the reins and they went down the rise toward their home. The house was exactly what he had described. 4 rooms, plain and well built, with a wood stove in the main room and windows that let in the light generously. And yes, a porch that ran the whole front of the house and was wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table, and the kind of evening she had wanted. She moved through the rooms with the baby on her hip, opening windows, taking the measure of the spaces, already seeing in her mind how things would be arranged, and what she would plant in the small yard, and what needed to be done first. Elijah stood in the doorway of the main room and watched her. "You are already planning things," he said. "I am planning everything," she said. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him about the kitchen arrangements and the garden she wanted to plant in the spring and the way she thought the main room should be set up so that the evening light came in on the sitting area. She told him about the books she wanted to order from the bookseller in San Antonio and the school she was already thinking about for Thomas in a few years. There being, she noted, a small settlement school 12 miles to the east that she intended to visit. She talked about the ranch's possibilities, about what she had read of hill country cattle ranching, and what she thought their acreage might reasonably support, about whether there was any possibility of growing a small kitchen garden despite the dry summers, about whether the local settlement had a church, and what the quality of its congregation was likely to be. She talked, and Elijah leaned against the doorframe of their house in the fading light of their first evening there, and he listened with his whole self, the way he always did. The way she had learned was simply who he was, and when she finally paused, he was smiling the real smile. "You have been thinking about this for a long time," he said. "Since September of last year when you first told me about it," she said. "I have been storing up thoughts. There were a great many of them." "There always are," he said, not critically, with the specific pleasure of a man who has found this to be one of the best facts about his life. That first winter on the Frio River was a working one. There was always something to be done with a new property, fencing to check and mend, the practical arrangements of a working ranch to be set in order, the social fabric of the local community to be entered carefully. The nearest town of any size was Uvalde, a day's ride to the south, and there was the smaller settlement of Trident Crossing to the east, where the school was, and where a small community of ranching families had built something modest but real. Julia and Elijah rode into Trident Crossing together the first Sunday after their arrival, Elijah on his horse and Julia on the gentle mare he had bought for her from a neighbor, with the baby in a carrier across her chest, and they attended the Sunday gathering, which was held in the schoolhouse because there was not yet a church, and Julia met the neighbors with her characteristic directness and interest, and Elijah stood beside her and was steady in the way that he was steady, and they were received well. 2 sensible and capable people who had come to work their land, which was all most of the community required. She made friends. It was not always easy in the hill country communities, which had been hard built and could be hard to penetrate, but Julia had never had difficulty with the actual work of friendship, the genuine interest and the honest exchange, and she found in the small community of ranching women a particular warmth that she had not quite expected. These were women who worked. They did not have time for the drawing-room social codes that Julia had always found constraining. They respected capability and directness, and the willingness to be useful. A woman named Clara Reyes became her closest friend, a Mexican-American woman whose family had ranched in the hill country for 3 generations, whose Spanish English was fluid and easy, and who had a ranch 10 miles to the west that she ran largely herself, while her husband drove cattle to market 4 months of the year. Clara had 2 children and a practical wisdom about the country that Julia recognized and admired. They met at the schoolhouse gathering and discovered within an hour that they were similarly minded about most things that mattered, by which I mean they both believed that the land required care rather than conquest, that children required honesty rather than rules, and that the women of the hill country deserved more say in the decisions that shaped their lives. They also discovered a shared and entirely unladylike appreciation for dark humor, which sealed the friendship permanently. Clara rode over to the Finley place the following Thursday with a jar of preserved pears and the practical wisdom that the near pasture had a tendency to flood in spring rains, and that Elijah should build the lower fence line above the creek bank rather than below it, which turned out to be exactly right, and which Elijah acknowledged with the equanimity of a man who respects competent advice regardless of its source. The ranch grew into itself over that first year. Elijah brought in a small herd of mixed cattle, the beginning of what he planned to build into something sustainable, and the work of managing a working ranch in the Texas Hill Country was demanding and constant, but it was also, Julia discovered, deeply satisfying in a way that the store had not quite been. She was part of it from the beginning, not as a domestic appendage to Elijah's enterprise but as a genuine partner in its management. She kept the books. She was better with numbers than he was, which he acknowledged freely and without any sense that it diminished him. She corresponded with buyers and suppliers. She made decisions about the household and the kitchen garden and the various arrangements of the property that were squarely within the domestic sphere that the era assigned to women. But she also sat with Elijah in the evenings, and they talked through the ranch decisions together, every significant one, so that both of them understood what they were doing and why, and what the risks were. He had told her before they married that he wanted her to be a real part of it. He had kept his word in every particular. By the spring of 1882, the ranch had a name. They had argued about it in the pleasant, ranging way of people who enjoy the argument as much as the conclusion, considering several options over several evenings before landing on what Julia called the obvious answer. Finley River Ranch, she said. That is very straightforward, he said. We are very straightforward people, she said. He considered this. Fair enough, he said. Finley River Ranch it was, burned into a plank of cedar that Elijah set above the gate at the road, and Julia felt a specific and deep pride every time she rode under it, a pride that was not about the name but about what the name meant, that this was real, that they had built it, that it was theirs. Young Thomas was 2 years old that spring and was developing into a person of definite opinions, which delighted Julia and amused Elijah, who said with perfect gravity that he had no idea where the child had acquired this quality. He gets it from you, I am certain, Julia said. He gets it from both of us, Elijah said. He is going to be magnificent and exhausting in equal measure. He was right on both counts. That spring also brought a new development that Julia had anticipated with a mixture of excitement and practical concern. She was expecting again. She told Elijah on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the wide porch in the last of the day's light, the way she told him important things directly and immediately without building to it. I am expecting another child, she said. He looked at her. The porch light was on his face and the live oaks were moving in the spring breeze, and down by the river the frogs were starting their evening conversation. Are you well? He asked. I am very well, she said. He reached over and took her hand. They sat like that in the last of the light, listening to the frogs and the wind and the sound of young Thomas asserting himself inside the house over some matter of bedtime. And Julia thought about what her father had said about her mother, that the two of them had lived a whole life in the conversations they had, that a marriage was built of words as much as anything else. "I want to tell you something," Julia said. "Tell me," he said, which was what he always said. "I was told I talked too much for a frontier wife," she said. "And now I am sitting on a wide porch on a ranch I helped build, with a husband who has never once looked at his watch while I was speaking, expecting our second child, and I want to say for the record that Harrison Hargrove was the most wrong a person has ever been about anything." Elijah laughed, the full laugh, the one that had first surprised her into recognizing what she felt about him. "For the record," he said, "I have been listening to you for years, and I intend to go on listening for the rest of my life, and not once in all of that time have I thought you said too much. I have only ever thought that I wanted to hear more." Julia looked at her husband in the spring evening light, in the sound of frogs and wind and a 2-year-old announcing his position on bedtime, and the feeling that moved through her was too complete for a single word. It was love and gratitude, and the particular deep contentment of someone who has found exactly the life they were meant for. "Good," she said, "because I have a great many more things to say." "I am counting on it," he said. The second child was born in November of 1882, another boy, which delighted Thomas the elder in the way that brothers delight children who are old enough to understand the concept. They named him Samuel for Elijah's father, a man who had died before Julia ever knew him but whom Elijah described as having been a man of quiet integrity, which was the finest thing, Elijah said, that he could say about a person. Samuel was different from Thomas in the way that siblings are so often entirely themselves despite sharing the same origin. Where Thomas was all forward motion and decided opinion, Samuel was watchful and slow to speak, and when he did speak, unexpectedly precise. He was 3 months old before Julia realized that he was watching her with an attention that reminded her powerfully of his father. "He watches everything," she told Elijah. "He is listening," Elijah said. "He is already listening." Clara Reyes, who came to see the new baby with a meal and the brisk competence of a woman who understood what a new mother needed, held Samuel and looked at him seriously and said, "This one is going to know all the secrets." "He already knows mine," Julia said. "The ranch grew steadily through those years." Elijah had a gift for the slow, careful work of building something durable, and the Finley River Ranch expanded its herd and improved its pastures and built a proper barn and added 2 rooms to the house as the family required them, and it became something real and established in the community of the hill country. Julia taught herself additional skills of the country, the kind of practical knowledge that the frontier required, and that she found genuinely interesting rather than merely necessary. She learned to treat common ailments and injuries because the nearest doctor was often too far, learning from books and from Clara, and from the collective knowledge of the women around her, who held between them a significant portion of the medical knowledge of the county. She became the person neighbors came to when there was a question about a sick child or a wound that needed tending, which she did with the same honest directness she brought to everything, telling people what she knew and what she did not know in equal measure. She also continued to write. Her journals filled a shelf over the years, an account of the ranch and the country and the people in it that she wrote with a genuine literary care that she had never discussed with anyone except Elijah, and later, the boys. She wrote about the injustice she saw in the country around her, the continued displacement of the Lipan Apache and the Comanche from their ancestral lands in the hill country, a process that had been nearly complete by the time the Finleys arrived but whose consequences were visible in the land itself, and in the stories the older ranchers told. She wrote about it honestly, as a wrong that had been done and that could not be undone, but that a person of conscience was obligated to name. She and Elijah talked about this too, the way they talked about everything. "Do you think there is anything to be done?" she asked once, after a particularly painful conversation with an old rancher who had described the removal of the last Lipan families from the region in terms that had made Julia's stomach turn. "I think naming it honestly is the beginning," Elijah said. "I think treating the land with the respect it deserves is part of it. I think making sure our boys know the truth about where they are standing and what it cost is something." "It is not enough," Julia said. "No," he said, "it is not. But it is what is in our hands." She wrote that exchange in her journal and kept it. The boys grew. Thomas at 5 was reading, and at 7 was reading things that made Julia realize she needed to order more books from the San Antonio bookseller. Samuel at 4 was still the quiet observer, the one who noticed everything, who would come to Julia with sudden, precise observations about the ranch or the animals or the people who visited that were startling in their accuracy. Elijah taught them to ride and to work and to be honest and to pay attention. Julia taught them to read and to think and to say what they meant and to be interested in the world. Together, they tried to teach them that people were worth listening to, that the opinions of others had value even when you disagreed with them, that the world was a more interesting place if you paid it attention. Thomas, at 7, announced at supper one evening that he wanted to be a lawyer. "Why?" Elijah asked. "Because Mama says there are too many unjust things and not enough people willing to argue about them," Thomas said. Julia looked at her husband across the table. Elijah looked back at her with an expression that managed to convey that he was very proud of their son, and also that Julia had somewhat unsurprisingly had an influence on the boy. "That seems like a good reason," Elijah said. Samuel at 5 announced that he wanted to be a rancher. "That is a good thing to want," Elijah said. "I want to run this ranch," Samuel said, "when I am old enough." "You will have to earn it," Elijah said, "but it will be here." Julia looked at her younger son, serious-eyed and certain, and thought about the word earn, about the way it contained a promise that was also a responsibility, and she thought that this was exactly the right way to raise children, with honest expectation and genuine love in equal measure. The spring of 1885 brought a drought to the hill country that was serious enough to worry everyone. The river dropped and the grass went brown earlier than usual, and the cattle needed to be moved to the better graze in the eastern pastures, and the community gathered at the schoolhouse to talk through the practical management of the shared water sources that several ranches depended on. Julia went to that meeting. She sat with Elijah among the ranching families, and she listened to the men argue about water rights and stock rotation and the economic implications of a sustained dry season. And when there was a point that was being missed, she said so, directly and clearly. There was a moment of silence when she spoke. She had become known in the community and was generally respected, but it was still 1885, and a woman speaking at a community meeting of ranchers was not entirely unremarkable. The silence had the quality of recalibration. Then old Robert Crane, who had the largest operation in the area and had been in the hill country longer than anyone else at that meeting, said, "The woman is right. That is exactly the issue. What do you propose?" She proposed a rotation system for the shared creek access that she had worked out at home the previous evening with pen and paper. Something practical and fair that distributed the resource according to need rather than traditional priority, which she acknowledged was a departure from the established practice, and then explained clearly why she thought the departure was justified by the current conditions. They adopted her proposal. Not because she was a woman making an unusual contribution, but because it was a good proposal, and the practical men of the hill country, when it came down to cases, cared more about practical solutions than social convention. On the ride home that evening, Elijah was quiet for a while in the comfortable way of a man who is thinking about something pleasant. "What?" Julia asked. "You know what," he said. "Say it anyway," she said. He looked sideways at her in the evening light on the road home through the live oaks. "You talk too much for a frontier wife," he said, with a straightness of face that cost him something. She could see it. Julia pressed her lips together against the laugh. "And what happened?" she asked. "The whole county is going to get through the drought," he said, "because you talk too much." She let the laugh come then, and he joined it, and the horses moved through the evening hill country, and the boys were ahead of them on their own ponies, and the stars were coming out one by one in the Texas sky, and the life they had built was full and real and entirely their own. By the time the drought broke in the late fall and the rain came soft and steady off the Gulf and filled the Frio back to its proper level, the Finley River Ranch was as established as the live oaks around it. Not wealthy in the way of the large operations to the south, but solid, debt-free, respected in the community, and home in the most complete sense of the word. Julia was 31 that fall. Elijah was 40. They had been married nearly 6 years and had built a life that Julia would have had to strain to describe to the young woman she had been in the spring of 1879. Not because it was grander than she had imagined, but because it was more specific, more detailed, more full of particular and unexpected grace. On a November evening, with the first cold front of the season having pushed through the day before, and the air sharp and clean and the stars outrageous in their clarity, they sat on the wide porch with their coffee, while the boys were inside arguing cheerfully about something that did not require parental intervention, and Julia felt the completeness of the moment settle over her like a blanket. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I am listening," he said, which he always said. "I have been thinking about my father lately," she said. "About what he used to say about my mother, that they lived a whole life in their conversations, that the talking was the real substance of it." "He told me something similar," Elijah said. "The second summer I came through Caldwell. He told me that the best thing a man could do for a woman he loved was to be genuinely interested in her." Julia looked at him. "He said that to you?" "He did," Elijah said. "He said it was the thing he had failed to do enough of with your mother in the early years before he understood it. He said by the time he understood it he could not do it enough to make up for the time." Julia was quiet for a moment. She felt her father in the conversation, the specific weight of him, his patience and his slow wisdom. "He knew you were coming back for me," she said. "I think he did," Elijah said. "He made it very easy for me to do it properly." "You would have done it properly regardless," she said. "I would have tried," he said, "but it helped to know he approved." They sat in the cold, clear night, and inside the house the boys' argument had resolved itself into the sound of laughter, and the Frio River was running full and cold below the ridge, and the live oaks were dark shapes against the star-thick sky. "I am expecting again," Julia said. Elijah turned to look at her. "When?" he said. "June, I think," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it that first September evening on the rise above the ranch, and held it with the same steadiness. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "Better than either time before, actually." "Do you know what you want?" he asked. "I want what we always have," she said. "Whatever comes." "A girl, perhaps," he said. "Perhaps," she said. "Although Thomas and Samuel might find that surprising." "It would be very good for them," Elijah said. She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together on their wide porch in the November night, and the horses moved in the corral below them, and the stars went on forever in every direction. And Julia Finley, who had been told she talked too much for a frontier wife, was exactly where she had always deserved to be, in a life built on the radical and simple premise that her words had value, and the person beside her had always been willing to hear them. Their daughter was born in June of 1886, on a bright and windy day when the wild plum blossoms were just finishing, and the air smelled of green things. She arrived with a characteristic decisiveness that informed her parents immediately that she would be a person of particular presence. Elijah held her in the first hour, and looked at her with the same undone expression he had worn twice before, and Julia watched him hold this new daughter, and felt the love expand again, which she had learned by now was one of love's most remarkable properties, its capacity to be larger than you thought it could be. They named her Alina, for no one in particular, but because the name had weight and clarity, and Julia thought that a name should suggest who a person might grow into. The boys received Alina with a mixture of wariness and fascination that resolved by the end of the first week into a protective devotion that Julia found both touching and entirely predictable. Thomas in particular took his role as elder brother with a seriousness that made Elijah bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. "You are 9, Elijah told Thomas, when Thomas solemnly informed him that he had been keeping watch over Alina's cradle. "She is 3 days old. I think between your mother and me, we have the watching reasonably covered. Someone has to be in charge of her when you are in the pasture," Thomas said with complete gravity. Elijah looked at Julia over Thomas's head. Julia looked back at him with an expression that said, very clearly, that she did not know where the boy had acquired this quality either. The years built into themselves the way that good years do, each one distinct and full, each one adding to what came before. The ranch expanded in slow and careful stages as the boys grew into their roles on it. Thomas went away to school at 16, to an institution in San Antonio that Elijah and Julia had researched with considerable care, a school that took its academic mission seriously, and that produced, along with its graduates, a genuine sense of what learning was for. He was magnificent and exhausting, exactly as predicted. His letters home were long and detailed and full of the particular earnestness of an intelligent young person encountering a wider world for the first time, and Julia and Elijah read them together and were glad. Samuel stayed closer to home by nature and by choice. He worked alongside his father with the easy partnership of two people who understood each other well, the quiet son and the steady father, and the ranch in their combined hands became the strong and durable thing Elijah had always been building toward. Alina grew into her name with complete fidelity. She was her mother's daughter in the most particular ways, curious and direct and in love with words, and from the time she was old enough to sit at the writing table, she could be found there in the evenings, writing in the journal she had been given at her 6th birthday, recording the world of Finley River Ranch with an attention that her mother recognized from the inside. "She is going to be a writer," Clara Reyes told Julia, on a visit when Alina was 9 and had just read aloud a description of the way the river looked in September that had made Clara stop and look at the child with specific attention. "She is going to be whatever she chooses," Julia said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "But she is going to be a writer." Julia and Elijah talked about their children the way they talked about everything else, honestly and at length and with genuine thought. They talked about Thomas's ambitions and whether he had the temperament for the law, which they both believed he did. They talked about Samuel's deep attachment to the land, and whether it was the right life for him or simply the most familiar one, and they agreed that the difference mattered, and that they should ask him the question directly when the time was right. They talked about Alina's mind, and how to give it the nourishment it required in a place and time that did not always make that easy for daughters. These were conversations that went on for years, ongoing threads of thought between two people who had made a practice of thinking together. Elijah said to Julia once, when they were in their 40s and the children were growing and the ranch was solid and the life they had built was fully itself, "Do you remember what you said to me in that first summer, about what you wanted your life to look like?" "I said I wanted the kind of talking that we do," Julia said, "as an ordinary daily thing." "Is it what you wanted?" he asked. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "It is more than what I wanted," she said. "Because I did not know then what it would be like to have it for years. I knew what I wanted, but I did not know what it would feel like to have a whole life of it." "What does it feel like?" he asked. Julia looked at her husband across the table, at the man she had been talking to for going on 20 years, at the face she knew as well as her own, the scar along his jaw and the gray-green eyes that had not changed, at the stillness of him that was one of the first things she had noticed, and that she loved still. "It feels like home," she said. "It feels like exactly what I was made for." He looked at her with the expression that he had worn on their wedding day, and on the day she told him about Thomas, and on every morning when she was sitting at the writing table, and he brought her coffee and paused for a moment before saying anything, and that expression was not a performance. It was simply the specific way that Elijah Finley looked at the person he loved most in the world. "I have been listening to you for almost 20 years," he said, "and I have never once been sorry for it. I have only ever wanted more." She smiled. "Good," she said, "because I have not come close to running out of things to say." "I know," he said. "That is one of the many things I am most grateful for." They sat at the table in the house on Finley River Ranch, in the Texas Hill Country, in the evening light that came through the west-facing windows, the way Elijah had always said it did, poured rather than shining. And outside the window the live oaks moved in the evening wind, and the Frio River ran clear and cold below the ridge, and the stars were preparing themselves for their nightly appearance. And the life they had built together was complete and full and entirely their own. Harrison Hargrove had told Julia Winslow that she talked too much for a frontier wife. He had been wrong in every way a person can be wrong about another person. He had been wrong about what the frontier needed, which was not silence but thought, not compliance but capability. He had been wrong about what a marriage could be, which was not management of a useful woman but the meeting of two equal minds. And he had been wrong, most of all, about Julia herself, who had never been too much for anything, only too much for the narrow shape of the life he had been building. Elijah Finley had listened from the beginning. He had listened because she was worth listening to. He had listened because he was a man who understood that the world is made of more than what is visible, that the words people use to tell you who they are deserve the same careful attention as the country you ride through, the same honest appraisal, the same respect for what is real and valuable in it. He had been listening for years, and in the listening, he had helped Julia build a life that was the full size of everything she had always been. The evening star appeared above the live oaks, first of the night, steady and clear, and Julia Finley looked at it from her place at the table with her husband, and thought that it was a very fine thing to be exactly who you were and to be known and loved for it without reservation, and that this was not a small thing. It was the whole thing. It was everything, and she had it, and she intended to keep it for all the years that were still coming.